Friends of our Testament, come back to that reading we read a little earlier. 1 Samuel chapter 26. David again spares Saul's life. Friends, it's not unusual in the Bible to find two incidents that are remarkably similar recorded quite close together. In the Gospel of Mark chapter 6, we read of Jesus feeding the 5,000. Turn the page over to Mark chapter 8, and there we find the feeding of the 4,000. The accounts are very similar and at some points even identical. We come to a very similar situation in 1 Samuel chapter 26. 2 chapters previously we read about the incident in the cave of En-gedi, where David had but did not take the opportunity to put an end to his troubles by putting an end to Saul. Last week in chapter 25, Saul briefly moved into the background of the narrative as we follow David's dealings with Nabal and the powerful lesson he learned from Nabal's wife Abigail. Now in chapter 26 we find an incident remarkably similar to that in chapter 24. Saul, if you remember, had promised to leave David alone. If we believe Saul's words outside the En-gedi cave, the hostilities between them were now over. But now comes the test in our passage. Had Saul's heart toward David really changed? The proof was about to take place, verse 1. The proof was about to take place, verse 1. The Ziphites went to Saul at Gibeah and said, "Is not David hiding in the hill of Hachilah which faces Jezreel?" Verse 2, so Saul went down to the desert of Ziph with 3,000 chosen men of Israel to search there for David. So much for Saul's earlier empty words. Let's be honest, we don't get the impression, do we, verse 2, that Saul was seeking a friendly chat. Despite the experience at En-gedi, Saul did what he had done previously. He went down to the desert of Ziph, just as he had gone to the desert of En-gedi. And let's not misplace the power Saul still had at his disposal. 3,000 of Israel's biggest and best. But the important point here, friends, the important point here to note, however, is that Saul clearly had not changed. In chapter 24, verse 16, yes, we read that Saul lifted up his voice and wept. Is that your voice, David, my son? And he wept aloud. But as we know, tears are not always a sign of a tender heart, are they? Tears are not always a sign of genuine repentance. Words and tears are not enough. The true state of Saul's heart is revealed in verse 2. So Saul went down to the desert of Ziph on his own, with 3,000 chosen men of Israel, to search there for David. Saul and his soldiers arrived at the spot where he had been informed David was hiding, verse 3a, if you follow it. Saul made his camp beside the road on a hill of Hachilah, facing Jezreel. However, this time, the Ziphites' information was not quite so accurate. For we read verse 3b, but David stayed in the wilderness, in the desert. This time, the tables were dramatically turned. What at first sight looked like Saul's great advantage, i.e. the 3,000 men, turned out to be impossible to conceal. Saul had no hope of the element of surprise, and without surprise the initiative then fell to David. Verse 4, when David saw that Saul had followed him there, he sent out scouts, he sent out spies, and learned that Saul had definitely arrived. Then David set out and went to the place where Saul had camped, verse 5. Looking down upon this camp, he saw where Saul and Abner, son of Ner, the commander of the army, had lain down. Saul was lying inside the camp, with the army encamped around him. Now David, friends, looking down upon this camp, could see the manner in which the men were protectively arranged around Saul and around Abner. Just like the spokes around the hub of a wheel. Get that picture, please, in your mind for a moment. Just like the spokes around the hub of a wheel, that's the picture of this camp. For all the men were round and about it. And right at the centre, right at the hub, was Saul and Abner, the captain of the army. Looking down upon this camp, David was then found to ask the question, verse 6b, who will go down to the camp with me to Saul? With him would go his nephew, Abishai. He was the man prepared to step forward and to be courageous for the king. It was a bold move, go into the camp of the very one who was plotting his death. It was a bold move, deliberately go into the very place where Saul lay sleeping. But that is what this expedition entailed. So David and Abishai went to the army by night, verse 7. And there was Saul laying asleep inside the camp with his head stuck in the ground, with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Abner and the soldiers were lying round him. This was an opportunity too good to miss. For Abishai said to David, verse 8, today God has given your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of my spear. I'll only do it once. I won't need to do it the second time, he says, look. Abishai was sure that it was God's will that he kill Saul and put an end to his selfish rule and his relentless persecution of Israel's true king. But David stopped him. David, if you remember, had settled this matter in the cave of En-gedi, hadn't he, in chapter 24. And there was no need to consider it again. He also had seen what the Lord did to Nabal. When Abishai looked at Saul, he saw an enemy. When David looked upon Saul, he saw the Lord's anointed. David knew, friends, that it was wrong to lay hands on God's anointed, even though the king wasn't serving as God wanted him to serve. David didn't need to respect the man, but he did respect the office and the God who gave it. And David said, verse 10, as surely as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him. Either his time will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. David's restraint there was because he trusted God. David did not know how the Lord would deal with Saul. But trusting God means believing that God's promises will come to pass in God's time and in God's way. It was not for David to take Saul's life in Abishai's way. However, if you're following, David did take something. Instead of taking Saul's life, verse 12, David took the spear and the water jug near Saul's head, and they left. The spear and the water jug, the instrument of aggression and the source of sustenance in the desert. Without violence, David, friends, symbolically disarmed Saul and took his life. That's what that's saying. This symbolic action underlined David's refusal to do the actual real thing. You remember, just like cutting off the corner of the king's robe in the cave of En-gedi, Saul's life a second time round had been spared. Verse 12, no man saw or knew about it. Fancy that. Nor did anyone wake up. They were all sleeping while this was going on. David and Abishai make it in and out of the camp without waking anybody up. Do you notice it there? How was that? How was that? Well, because the Lord had put them into a deep sleep. Friends, this deep sleep was of the Lord. Just like that of Adam when he created Eve, Genesis 2 verse 21. Just like that of Abraham when he was given the promise, Genesis 15 verse 12. God had kept his chosen king safe. Once they were safely out of the camp, David now moves to the top of a hill and calls out to Abner, Saul's commander, Saul's bodyguard, taunting him for his failure to guard his king, verse 15b. Why did you guard the Lord your king? Someone came to destroy your Lord the king. What have you done? What you have done is not good. As surely as the Lord lives, you and your men deserve to die, because you did not guard your master, the Lord's anointed. Look around you. Where are the king's spear and water jug that were near his head? The absence of the spear and the cruse of water was evidence enough that someone indeed had been close to the king and could have killed him. Who saved the king, Abner, while you slept? Abner was speechless, stunned by what he'd heard. He said not a word. But recognizing David's voice, look, verse 17, Saul calls out to him, Is that your voice, David, my son? Isn't that exactly what he said outside the En-Gedi cave? But notice David's response, please. David did not call him my father, as he had done before in chapter 24, verse 11. His address was only, yes, it is, my lord the king. Saul's daughter, Michal, was no longer David's wife. Chapter 25, verse 44. So David was no longer son-in-law to the king. And once again, David tried to reason with Saul and show him how wrong he was in his thinking and acting. Verse 18 to 20. What still puzzled David was why King Saul pursued him so untiringly when he had proved that he meant him no harm. He says here, look, if the Lord had stirred up Saul, in other words, if David had broken one of God's laws, then he was willing to bring a sacrifice and have his sins forgiven by the Lord. But on the other hand, if men had influenced Saul's hostilities towards David because of lies his officers had told about him, then they were the offenders. And may they be cursed before the Lord, verse 19. Saul had no more reason to fear David than to fear a flea or a partridge in the mountains. Look. Verse 21, then Saul said, I have sinned. Come back, David, my son, return, because you considered my life precious today. I will not try to harm you again. Surely I have acted like a fool, and I've erred greatly. Once again, friends, Saul lapsed into one of his sentimental moods and confessed that he was a fool and a sinner. He promised that he wouldn't harm David, but David didn't believe him. His response to Saul's invitation to come back was, here's the king's spear, let one of your young men come and get it. David and Saul both knew the significance of the spear in their relationship. For the second time, as I said, David was spared. David had spared Saul's life and knew that the Lord would honour him. The Lord would reward him for it, verse 23. The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and faithfulness. David had been righteous in his behaviour towards Saul, who was, after all, still king of Israel. That verse goes on, the Lord gave you into my hands today, but I would not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. David did the right thing with regard to Saul. He exercised patience and restraint. David knew what God's will was not to do, i.e. seek revenge. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. David's refusal to lift his hand against the king was seen, friends, as righteousness. Verse 24, surely as I valued your life today, so may the Lord value my life and deliver me from all trouble. David, in that verse, asked the Lord to reward him with protection and safety, just as he, David, had protected the king. David's firm trust in God, that the Lord would deliver him from all trouble, was seen as faithfulness. Righteousness and faithfulness should be characteristic of all God's people, as you and I hear this afternoon. Righteousness and faithfulness are what we must pursue in our walk with the Lord. The last thing that Saul ever said to David was verse 25. It's a statement that affirms the greatness of David's deeds and the certainty of his kingship. May you be blessed, my son David. You will do great things and surely triumph. With that, it seems the two men part alone. For Saul, that was true, but for David, the Lord was with him, wasn't he? He was the one who would deliver him from every trouble. Come back, if you follow in verse 21. As for Saul, the three things that he says in verse 21, they would be a good epitaph upon his life, and with this I close. For there we read, he said these words, I have sinned, I have played, I have acted the fool, I have erred greatly, I have erred exceedingly, the Authorized Version reads. I trust those words will not be true of your life or my life, but instead, like David, we would all allow the presence of God and the determination to go through with God all the remaining days that God gives us on this earth. If you know not the Lord, I'm preaching to the converted, but if you know not the Lord, and the Lord knows the heart, doesn't he? In love for your soul, will you be wise unto salvation and come to him this afternoon? Please hear and heed his word. Neither is there salvation in any other, for there is none other name under heaven given amongst men whereby we must be saved. Not the Catholic name, not the Protestant name, not the Baptist name, not the Pentecostal name. You can call yourself what you like, as long as your faith and trust is in the Lord Jesus Christ. True. Neither is there salvation in any other, for there is none other name under heaven given amongst men whereby we must be saved. Answer it honestly. Are we playing the fool? Or are we fighting the good fight and keeping the faith? May the Lord bless his word to our hearts and to his lives for his name's sake.